The man who's often known as the grandfather of modern day action animation is a man called Yutaka Nakamura. Nakamura, especially recently, has been known to produce these very flashy and large scale fights that by every single anime fan and essentially every Sakuga fan too, that it has basically come to a common consensus that he is the best at animation, at least in the action department. But what if I told you the reason why his action scenes are so compelling and so good isn't actually because he's good at animation? Now I know that this is a lot to say, especially when talking about the man himself, saying that he's constantly been doing this extremely technically proficient animation at an extremely high caliber to the point where he's doing extremely complicated background animation and really thought out and physically realistic character animation too. So it's very obvious that he's one of the most technically proficient animators in the entire industry. So why am I saying that the reason he's so good isn't actually because of his animation? Well, it's simply because that's not what makes him special. You see, there are a lot of animators in the industry today who work digitally mainly and are very technically impressive in terms of animation. Their animations have basically no melting. They're able to do background animation nearly perfectly at some points, and yet they still aren't as good as Nakamura. Well, it's because Nakamura is an absolutely phenomenal action director. Whenever he directs and boards a scene, he does it very meticulously while implementing his own principles in place. And while he doesn't have them necessarily written down on a sheet of paper, there are definitely things that he takes into mind when animating and storyboarding. So today we are going to go over what I think Nakamura's 12 most important principles of action direction are. But that's enough yap, so let's actually get into the video, and these are what I think Nakamura's 12 most important principles are in action direction. Number 1 is fast and slow. What fast and slow is, to put it really simply, is essentially something moving really fast while something also moving very slow in the same scene. You see right here, Nakamura is putting Todoroki's hand up very slowly so that we can kind of absorb every single detail of the scene, while also making all of his flames fly past him so we still understand that there's a lot going on. And what is really important that you notice if you put this into a storyboard is to not make fast and stopped. Fast and stopped is something you don't want. While it will kind of imitate the effect, you won't really get the full contrast that you want. But you can actually also do this in between shots. For example, in this sequence right here, you can actually see the first shot is moving very quickly, while the second shot that it cuts to right after is basically not moving at all. This actually also works really well with a character who's completely at a standstill, instantly zapping into a quick speed. Now I've said enough about that, let's move on to the second principle. The second principle is big and small. Big and small is much like fast and slow, where it's a contrast of two different things. And this principle specifically pairs really well with fast and slow. Now this is used by Nakamura to show the full scale of a fight. And it especially hits really hard when there's a large environment or background, even if that background can be something like a night sky. And my favorite use of it is honestly when something like effects animations really dominate the scene, while the character who is making those effects animations sticks out but is really small to the point where you are kind of aware that they exist, you just don't care about it because the effects look really cool. But enough yapping, let's get on to the third principle. And the third principle definitely isn't created by him, he's just been the one who's been able to use it that well in an action scene, and kind of the one that's made it prominent in action scenes to begin with, as the third principle is contrast of colors. Contrast of colors is, again, exactly as it sounds, it's a contrast of colors. Essentially, this can be something very bright on your screen as the foreground, with the background being basically pitch black if you wanted to. This can make the viewer actually really focus in on a specific thing, but it's also just really cool to have in your action scene. But notice how I said contrast of color and not contrast of bright and darkness? Because you can also use this with color. We can see right here again in Deku vs Todoroki, the effects animations are really reigning supreme, but you can still see Todoroki is there because there's a massive fire, I guess. And that makes him stick out, but still let the effects really dominate the camera. But that's enough said about the third principle, so let's move on to the fourth. And the fourth principle is make everything a sharp geometric shape. Well, not everything, but like 90% of effects animations. When I'm talking about sharp geometric shapes, I'm really talking about three specifically. That is a circle, a square, and a triangle. The most popular use is the Yutapon cube, where they're basically turning these debris that are sometimes big, sometimes small, into really cubic forms, and it's always really aesthetically appealing to basically everyone. But he also created this sharp smear effect with a triangle, where these smears are basically turned into these really sharp triangles, and that is also stupidly aesthetically pleasing. And he doesn't even stop there, he actually shades with triangles, and that's also really appealing. It often gives a lot more depth. But those are just like the main uses. He obviously just turns everything else into a circle, a square, or a triangle, apart from all that stuff I just said. Like for example, here he turns the snow into a cube, or here in this MHA scene he turns into this giant effects of a circle, I guess, I don't even know. But he commonly uses circles in like things where effects are combining together. He uses cubes for anything that's like physical already in the world that kind of got knocked, and then he uses triangles for basically only smears. But that's just what he mainly uses. He's obviously actually used things like circles for smearing too, and I bet it would also look pretty cool if you used circles and squares for smears. In fact, that's kind of what One Piece and Akihiro Ota does. He uses these weird cool dotted smears that are basically complete circles, or I guess half circles at least, and just puts them everywhere, and it looks really cool. But let's get on to the fifth principle, and the fifth of Yutaka Nakamura's principles is overlaying a geometric movement with a very realistic fluid movement. Now you wouldn't actually notice this, but if you look into it deeply, then it really starts to resonate. A lot of the reasons that Nakamura's animations are so abstract at points, but feel really real, despite all the geometric shapes and wacky stuff he has, is actually kind of because he keeps you grounded in reality with these realistic, really realistic motions. This can be something like fabric animation, or something like really fluid motion. He just needs to keep some of it in a scene and it looks okay. And I'm not saying that you should always have something in this scene that's fluid or realistic. I'm just saying that if you're gonna have a very long scene, then you have to have some human movement to keep it grounded in reality. And this kind of is what happens to Nozomu's Abe's cuts, is that a lot of people don't like the slow motion he uses, simply because he uses it for too long. And while it's cool the first few seconds, it feels like it lacks impact after the rest of the cut is done, which is why his cuts look better when human motion is actually involved inside of the sequence. The sixth principle is a visual motif. Now this actually wasn't even remotely created by Nakamura, but again, just like contrast of color, he was really the first person to implement it into a fight scene. And Nakamura, I'm guessing, actually took this from some guy called Soul Bass. He is a director, I'm pretty sure, that essentially looked for these visual motifs consistently. And in anime especially, this is actually very prevalent. For example, Megumi Ishitani basically uses this in all of her openings and nearly everything she directs, except Ishitani mainly focuses on things that are emotionally important to the story, while Nakamura just puts it in an action scene. But in My Hero Academia, you can see right here actually that Deku is putting up his hand along with Todoroki putting up his hand. Despite it having nothing to do with their powers, he puts it in there anyway. He also does it throughout this scene right here with a bunch of circles, and this scene right here too, specifically with the color red, I guess, because basically every single time Zepp is on the scene, there's a certain amount of red on there. You can constantly look for these when you're storyboarding a scene, but this specifically is really hard to implement well. However, Nakamura still does it basically amazingly when it comes to action. And let's quit the yapping and go on to the seventh principle. And the seventh principle of Nakamura's is my personal favorite, which is delayed delivery. Delayed delivery, again, wasn't created by Nakamura. He's just one of the first people to use it in action in anime. Delayed delivery is really simply just delaying the effect of something. You can actually see it really well in the clips I'm showing you. He uses it really commonly for slicing enemies apart because it does look really good, or just completely decomposing the other enemy. And a lot of the time he will use it when someone is moving really fast across something, as it does look very good. But I think its greatest use is Saitama vs. Boros. There's just so much to take in right here. And this actually plays into our next principle too, as our eighth principle is layering or laddering. It's again really prevalent in this Saitama vs. Boros little shot right here. It's where essentially it's kind of working with delay, but basically it's like layers of short bursts of energy. This also works with something trying to pile onto something else, and it's kind of hard to explain, but I hope I'm showing it to you well with the clips I'm currently putting on screen. But there's not much to be said about this, it just looks really cool. And for our ninth principle is arguably the most important on this list. It's exaggerated variation in motion. What this essentially means is that you should try to keep your things not symmetrical. If you have a walk cycle, don't make it symmetrical. Make it like they walk with a limp. If their hair is blowing back and forth, definitely don't repeat the same frames over and over again. Instead, use completely new frames for every single drawing. Same for effects animations, just use a new frame every single drawing. Try to put in as much variation as you can while not overwhelming the viewer. To be honest, a lot of this does come with natural human movement, so if you already know what natural human movement looks like and you're animating a scene, then just use your own intuition. So the 10th principle of Nakamura's principles is to put your camera inside the action scene. Just put your camera in the action scene. This basically forces you to create really dynamic perspectives and movements. And while I can't say that it's absolutely necessary for every single shot, I would say use it about 1 in every 5 shots in an action sequence. Obviously, depending how long and short your shots are, it's gonna differ. But other than that, let's just go on to the next principle, because again, I don't have many clips to play. And the 11th principle, which in my opinion is one of the most underrated principles that I don't think anybody talks about. The 11th principle is frames having direction. This one is really easy, and it can really elevate your action scene if you do it correctly. What essentially this means is to make sure your movements are kind of only going one way if they're a large scale move. And the thing is, when this happens and it's done very well, your eyes basically able to interpret where the action's gonna go and kind of does it on its own. You can also sometimes use this to fake out someone so that they think something's gonna happen but something else actually does happen. However, I don't recommend that second one simply because it's not always appealing. But the easiest way to do this is just to make sure smear frames are all going a certain way, and to make sure all your effects animations are also kind of levitating towards one way. Finally, let's go to our 12th principle of animation in Nakamura's book. But the 12th principle is, in my opinion, also very underrated, and might be even less talked about than the principle I just mentioned. But the 12th principle is to make the camera play into itself. What I mean by that is, as stupid as it sounds, you want shakes and transitions. Whenever one fast action shot cuts to another fast action shot, it's actually really good to use this. Because there are 2 ways to make it understandable to the viewer, or I guess to make it flow well to the viewer. One of the ways is either to give the scene a lot of time to be able to basically culminate itself into a final product, or you can use a super cool transition like this that honestly, in my opinion, is way better. Nakamura, as far as I've seen, is probably the best at doing this, basically by far. But these are just my opinions, my own thoughts, and my own words of the subject. Let me know what you guys think down below about this. And it's late, dude. I want to sleep.